Well, I thought that I would entitle this sermon, How Shall We Then Live? And I have a reason for entitling it that, and we'll discover it as we go. But let me ask you a question. When circumstances go south on you, and trials and tribulations seem to mount, and it seems that everything presents itself to you as a difficulty and a challenge, and they don't seem to go away, and there just seems to be no remedy for the things you're going through, and none of them are resolved, and then new ones come along. And so when you get to that kind of situation, what do? I mean, you may think to yourself, well, it seems like I've tried everything. And it just seems like the more you try, the more things go from bad to worse. And it drags on, seemingly without relief. And you can find yourself at your wit's end. This is where people truly get tested. This is a place of divine providence, and it is an opportunity to grow or to be destroyed. It's just the way that it is. And God knows what He's doing. But sometimes you get to that spot when you're wearing through all these trials, and how do I proceed? And let's say that that's not just happening to you. Let's say it's happening to everyone around you. Your family, your neighbors, your friends, your loved ones. And the culture itself appears to be on the path of decay and dissolution. And it doesn't seem, when you look at it, there's any hope that's on the horizon. Well, I say all that because I firmly believe that our nation is in the throes of decay. And we may ask ourselves, what are we to do? Because it's not something that's just cropped up. It's been creeping fast, and I think most anybody can see it. And in the midst of this, and as it goes on, you look at the trajectory of it, you can say, well, then what are we supposed to do when we get up in the morning? How then shall we live in the midst of all these things? Never mind, you can have personal trials and crosses that you bear. And I had a book, and I probably first read this book probably around 1977, 1978. And it was a book written by Francis Schaeffer in 1976. And it's entitled, what I've just entitled the sermon, How Shall We Then Live? And Francis Schaeffer basically takes the history of philosophy, the history of art, the history of science, the history of culture, and shows you the panoramic view of it. And there's lots of pictures in the book. Maybe that's why I was drawn to it, lots of pictures. But there's lots of good pictures. Very nice book it is. And he draws you through all these things, art, architecture, all these things with nice, big, glossy photos. But it's what he writes in conjunction with this history of art and architecture and culture and philosophy, paintings, all these things. He shows you the trajectory of humanity and where it had brought them to in 1976 when this book was first published. And I wasn't thinking of the book when I prepared the sermon. I prepared the sermon and I think, what am I entitling this sermon? What's the kind of like a theme? And that title popped in my head because I realized this is very similar to that book. Now, years ago, I lent the book out to somebody and it's gone. And I've chastised myself for not doing that, but when a book is so good and I think someone can really profit that they would have a specific interest in it, then you lend it out like, hey, make sure I get it back. Well, you don't get it back. And I don't think people are stealing, but they just forget and it goes on a shelf somewhere. They take a long time to read it, and then they, keep meaning to bring it, and then it just goes out of the mind. But I can't do that anymore. But in that book, How Should We Then Live? So this morning, just maybe a half hour before we came here, I said, let me look that up. And I looked up the book because I haven't had it for years. And I wanted to see, like, it can still buy it, that kind of thing. And I said, let me look at what Wikipedia says about it. I'm going to read you this is Wikipedia. So this is not even a religious outlet and not even necessarily a dependable outlet. But I've read the book more than once. And its description here is very accurate. And I'm not going to read everything, but this, in the overview, it says this. And I think it's very good. Schaeffer's central premise in the book is, when we base society on the Bible, on the infinite personal God who is there and has spoken, this provides an absolute by which we can conduct our lives and by which we can judge society. This leads to what Schaeffer calls, quote, freedom without chaos, end quote, a perfect description. If you're going to look at the world through the lens of the scriptures by faith, you're going to inherit freedom, but it's freedom without chaos. They continue, when we base society on humanism, which Schaeffer defines as, quote, a value system rooted in the belief that man is his own measure, that man is autonomous, totally independent. In other words, we have to come up with our own morals, end quote. Then all values are relative, and we have no way to distinguish right from wrong, except for, quote, synthesis, pragmatism, and utilitarianism, which is it's very concise. But what he says is, the modern society that doesn't have a religious belief, just whatever everybody thinks, they base their morals on synthesis. Well, what's the majority say? Synthesis, and that must be the truth. Or they base it on pragmatism. Oh, if it advances my cause, that must be the right thing because, hey, I'm better off because of it. Yeah, but what about the moral thing? What about the responsibility you have to the greater society? So we base our decisions on morals based on synthesis, pragmatism, or utilitarianism. Is it going to be financially useful? Am I going to gain more power from it? And if the answer is yes to those, it's got to be the right thing. And he's not wrong. That's how we're doing things. They continue to summarize his book. Because, Schaeffer tells us, because we disagree on what is best for which group, this leads to fragmentation of thought, which has led us to the despair and alienation so prevalent in society today. In 1976. This fragmentation is expressed in the visual arts, in works such as, and he names a particular piece of art that was painted by Pablo Picasso. This work is considered to mark the beginning of modern art. Another premise is that modern relative values are based on personal peace. Parentheses, the desire to be personally unaffected by the world's problems. So that's what's the right thing to do. If it isn't going to bother me, then I'm okay with it. See? If it doesn't hurt anybody, it must be okay. You know how many people say that now? And they base their views not just on personal peace, but on affluence, Schaeffer tells us. In parentheses, an increasing personal income. He warns that when we live by these values, we will be tempted. Now listen to this. It was utterly prophetic. He is describing the way we are right now in 1976. He says, this is how we look at the world, not through the lens of God and the absolutes of God, but we will be tempted to sacrifice our freedoms in exchange for an authoritarian government who will provide the relative values. That's political correctness. The government will dominate and tell you what is right. He further warns that this government will not be obvious like the fascist regimes of the 20th century, but will be based on manipulation and subtle forms of information control. Well, that's all the social media. Even presidents of the United States can't be on social media, right? Information control, psychology, and genetics. Yeah, everything's race now. Yep, you always got to go back to that. Good way to steer the pot. That's now. I didn't see the Republican debate, but I was watching some clips of it after the fact. The debates they have on Wednesday night. We have a prayer meeting. I'm not going to see it. So I went back and I watched Vivek Ramaswamy make some good points. But there was one point he stated that particularly jumped out at me. And it jumped out at me because I've asked myself the same question for years. And it seems as though a lot of people aren't that interested in the question. I mean, when you bring it up, they don't avoid it. Like, they agree with you. Like, yeah, that's bad. But then immediately it's on to a new subject. And I get the impression we're underestimating the importance of this. And he was saying that, and I'm thinking, yeah, well, my wife could tell you how many times I've talked about this. Anyway, he noted that the younger population in the country, people in their 20s and 30s, many of them, and it's a growing number, have grown disillusioned, and even despondent. They're still functioning. They still say hello to you and smile, but they've grown disillusioned and despondent. And they've lost, he said, a healthy sense, because there's a bad sense of it, but a healthy sense of patriotism and camaraderie with their fellow citizens. He went on to say that this isn't the complete reason why, but he said one of the major factors to their disillusionment that they're experiencing is their loss of access to the American dream, which of course we're thinking of as home ownership. And he noted that they've been pressed to get their college degrees, but their college degrees have not given them a leg up on obtaining that dream. Just put them in the debt, and their degrees can buy you a little extra pay, but does it pay for itself? Or does it put these young people, when they're starting out in life, in a hole? And with the explosion of housing prices, which has been going on for a long time, skyrocketing, for those just starting out, and I think for the average person, they own a home, you say, oh, look at our house prices, but they think, well, mine are going up too, so it's all relative. But what about the people that hadn't started that process yet? Look at your average house, little tiny rinky-dinky ranch in Rhode Island. It's $300,000. What 25 or 30-year-old wants to say, yeah, I want to do that. But then if you want to go rent something, what's it going to be, $1,500? Let's see, most people don't worry about it because they've already passed that, right? They got their houses, their mortgages, and some of them have paid for their houses. So we admit that it's bad, but we brush it off. But you can't disillusion a whole generation and think your nation will survive it. Ramaswamy's right. The fact that Chris Christie is far ahead of Ramaswamy is sickening to my stomach. That's evil. And never mind what they're doing to Trump it's almost indescribable. Every time you look at the homepage of the news feed, it's hate. So some of these young people, they don't have any hope of having it like their parents and their parents' parents did. And we've been lying to ourselves. When I was in the 70s, they say, well, the next generation is going to have it better than the next. And I'm thinking, that's a lie. I could see that in the 70s. Or we built bigger houses. They were pieces of garbage. The McMansions. Yeah, I did a lot of roof on the McMansions. Yeah, they were big things, big structures. Maybe they're $500,000 to build the thing. They're made of cheap stuff. And I see these people with these kind of houses, and, if they order oil, they want to order 100 gallons. Some of them want to order 50 gallons. And they live in these, well, you know what? People aren't paying their bills. They're living on credit cards. And mom and dad are working for their bigger houses than their parents. Well, the parents, after World War II, dad worked, mom stayed home, and dad could pretty much have any job and afford some kind of house. And we've had several generations that have been used to that. Now, this up-and-coming generation, and it isn't just home ownership. But that's so important because of the other things that's already happened to them. What else has already happened to them? Their faith in God has been ripped out from underneath them by virtue of the public school system and the culture at large. They don't have any faith. And the ones that do say they have faith and they go to church, at least on occasion, for most of them, it isn't that real. It's a habit. Probably makes them feel good as long as it's short enough. And there's only one service, please. And it isn't the same. So we've removed from the young people faith in God. And that adds to the disillusionment, whether they realize it or not. We've lost our identity as a nation, as a people and a culture. What is the glue that holds us together? Our borders are wide open. The illegals flood the borders. Everybody knows they're putting them up in hotels and the taxpayers are paying for it. They're kicking out veterans and putting in illegals. And this Marxist, woke, lying, fake green, globalist, transgender culture of corruption and lawlessness will not spark any hope in any thinking young person, no matter how much they've been trained in liberalism. You can't tell me that's going to spark hope in them. It isn't going to do it. I'll be frank with you. Young people say, I don't think young people say it, but I think many of them, deep down inside, really don't feel like they have a purpose in life. They're not suicidal. But they're gray. They're bland. They got no fight in them. I understand. Based on the input they've received and where they're at, that makes total sense to me. And to put it more starkly, and even they might not want to admit this to themselves, they don't have a reason for living. And I think our nation has arrived at a fiscal and moral and spiritual crossroads that represents an existential threat to the nation. And let me say this, and I have no shame in saying this as a Christian minister. I'm angry about it. Well, you shouldn't be angry. It's the providence of God. So we just have to trust God and just, what? And not be angry about it? Not be angry about the evil, wicked, anti-Christianity that is removing hope from the next generation? Well, I got mine, and I guess I'll be able to retire and die comfy, and they'll just be on their own. Good luck for them. No, I'm going to be angry about it. Oh, don't let the sun go down your wrath. We read the Bible like idiots. I'm angry for my children. I'm angry for my children's children. But the question remains. How do we fight this? So, and people can have, it's not just, I'm speaking in broad terms, but then within that context, people can have personal problems. They can't afford their rent or their mortgage. Their wife or their husband wants to leave them. There's no faith in God. And even for the Christians, they're weaned on such pablum, they don't realize they don't have a faith. So what do you do when you get up in the morning? This has got to change, right? How shall we then live? See, that's what Francis, it made me think of the book this morning. I didn't think of the book till this morning. I thought of it when I said, I'll call it that. And then I got to thinking about the book and I looked it up. I printed that Wikipedia just before I came here. And that's what he's saying. He's showing you through all these different philosophy and art and architecture and all these things. Things have been changing, right? And then he makes a prediction in 76, which is true today. How then shall we live? It made me think of Jonathan. I like talking about Jonathan in the Bible because it's such a beautiful, it's both one of the most beautiful stories and the saddest stories, all bound up in one. Jonathan was David's friend, and he loved David dearly, as you know. And though Jonathan was legitimately in line to be the heir to the throne of his father, King Saul, the Lord had made it plain that Saul had sinned and he's going to remove the kingdom from him and give it to David. And Jonathan knew that. That throne was to be Jonathan's. But the Lord said it's going to be David's. Jonathan knew he was missing out on being the king of God's nation. And Jonathan was a God-fearing man. But Jonathan didn't hold it against David. David was taking his place. And Jonathan loved him and helped him and supported him, even though his father was trying to kill David. Jonathan sought to be faithful to David, but at the same time, he realized his obligation to his father, and he also wanted to be loyal and honored to his father. And it just seems like an impossible situation. I've always thought that. Go to 1 Samuel 19. You say, is this about Thanksgiving? It is. 1 Samuel 19 and verse 1. And Saul spake to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants, that they should kill David. Jonathan's father, the king, is saying, not just to his servants, but saying to his son, you need to kill David for me. What's Jonathan supposed to do? You talk about having problems. How is he supposed to live? What's he do when he gets up in the morning? It just seems like an impossible situation. And in chapter 20, verse 30, and David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, because he knows, Jonathan's father's trying to kill him, and David's trying to understand it. And he asked Jonathan, what have I done? What is mine iniquity? And what is my sin before thy father, that he seeketh my life? Good questions, right? And he said unto him, God forbid, thou shalt not die. Behold, my father will do nothing, either great or small, but he will show it me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. In other words, Jonathan's saying, my father tells me his plans. And when I find them out, I'll help you out. I'll give you a heads up. I'll make sure he won't wickedly murder you. So I'm on your side. And David sware moreover and said, thy father certainly knoweth that I have found grace in thine eyes. And he, in other words, his father, says to himself, let not Jonathan know this, that I want to kill him, lest he be grieved. And then David says, but truly, as the Lord liveth, as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death. That is the frame of mind of David. There's just one small step between me and death, Jonathan. I can't fight against your father. We always think of David as just like he's all strong and strength and faith, and he is all these things. But he's a man. He's made of flesh. And he's pouring out his distress to Jonathan. It's distressing to David. It's distressing to Jonathan. Life is terrible. Everything is wrong. What are they supposed to do? In chapter 20, verse 41, to skip things for time's sake, And as soon as the lad was gone, David rose out of his place toward the south and fell on his face to the ground and bowed himself 3 times. He met with Jonathan, and they kissed one another and wept with one another until David exceeded. Because I skipped a whole bunch of things, but they know David. Saul is now, he means business. He's going to try and kill David. And Jonathan said to David, notice, they wept and kissed each other until David exceeded. I almost picture that as just being a blob on the ground. He wore himself out and all his strength was expended. He couldn't even weep anymore. He's so distressed. And of course, Jonathan has to watch all this. And it's his father doing it. And you see, talking about having hardships and difficulties and mounting problems. Well, here it is. And Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. Like final farewells. David, try and live. So how then should Jonathan live? Everything is wrong. Everything. Well, how did Jonathan live? I'll tell you how. He just obeyed God in the situation that was before him in the moment he was living it. That's all he could do. He doesn't have any answers. He left the overall picture in God's hands, but whatever was before him in that moment or on that day, he just sought to do what was right. One day, he'd sneak out under the cover of darkness and go to David and say, David, my father's planning this. Look out. Do this. Thank you, Jonathan. And then, metaphorically, the next day, Saul's going out to fight the Philistines, which is a legitimate cause, a legitimate battle. And Jonathan says, my father trying to kill David, he's worth fighting against God. But now he's going to fight the Philistines. That's a righteous cause. I will go and fight next to my father and support him. And it was in that particular battle that both of them died. And when David gave the eulogy for their deaths in 2 Samuel chapter 1, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but verse 23, 2 Samuel 1:23, in this eulogy at their death, David says, Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. Father and son were not divided in their death. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. If you jump down to verse 26, then David says, I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. It was a spiritual, an emotional bond because they were going through the same dark tunnel together in a very difficult situation. How are the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perish? Everything's wrong. And Jonathan died, fighting next to his father. What did Jonathan do? What was he supposed to do? I already told you. He obeyed God in the situation that was before him in that moment. He couldn't control the situation. It was all out of his control. Everything was wrong. Everything was not as it should be. Everything was going from bad to worse. I mean, how much worse could it get than for Jonathan? I mean, maybe you can argue David. Oh, but there's one text I didn't read you, where just because of time, where Saul says, you're your worst enemy, Jonathan. He's saying to his son. As long as David's alive, you don't have your throne, and that throne belongs to you. You bring shame on your mother that brought you into this world to give you that throne. And he says, but Father, what has David done wrong? He's only been a blessing to you. And his father picked up that javelin and threw it like he did at David. He threw it at his son to kill his son. It was after he did that, he fought next to his father with the Philistines. I want you to think about that. I wonder to myself, well, who could have it worse? I mean, Jonathan is just one of those pitches. He couldn't control the situation. But here's the inside tip we have. He didn't have to. That is important. He didn't have to control the situation. He just, by faith, needed to obey the Lord in the thing he was facing in the moment he was living. And that is what Jonathan did. Jonathan died doing God's will. You say, but he died. But he died doing God's will. And we know about it in 2023. Jonathan's death was to forward the cause of the faith of God's people, and he is instrumental as a witness in that way. And all of this makes, our situation in America, the American dream, how then shall we live? And the same thing applies to Jonathan. Well, it got me thinking about the Pilgrims. Well, the Pilgrims got me thinking about all this, I guess it was. From their youth until they died, I'm talking about that first generation, right up to the end of their lives, nothing was stable for them. Things were always changing. The longer you think about it, you realize how true that is. And for them, life was hard. Their earthly crosses and burdens just seemed to be perpetual and always growing in intensity, unrelentingly. And all their multiplying hardships always seemed to be the byproduct of their being faithful to God the best they knew how. And by trusting the Lord and obeying Him, this is what their life was like. Their hardships came from their devotion to Christ. It seems the more they followed their conscience to obey the Lord, the harder things became. Life was hard. And there's no greater picture of that than Bradford himself. I want to just go through an overview of this. And you've heard these things before, but we're remembering the Pilgrims today. We're doing it for a reason. No more than one reason, I guess. But William Bradford was born in Austerfield, Doncaster, in 1589, and his father died when he was a year old. Right from the beginning. This is how it goes for William Bradford. And this only means so much if you haven't read his book. But if you read how he wrote about the history, then you have an inside window into the thinking and the interpretation of life as seen by William Bradford. And this history means more, a lot more. So his dad died when he was a year old. 2 or 3 years later, his mother remarried, and she took him and pawned him off on her grandfather while she lived with a new husband without her 3-year-old. I don't know why, but that's what happened. Well, it wasn't long after that the grandfather died. So now he's just a child. He has to go back to his mother and his stepfather. Well, if only like a year or 2 after that, she died. Stepfather didn't want him. So now he's like 7 or 8 years old at this point. Think about that. Shuffled around by his parents, by his mother that was living. His father died. So now when he's 7 or 8 years old, he's pawned off on his 2 very stern uncles, Robert and Thomas Bradford, who were farmers who didn't have much use for the boy because Bradford was very sickly as a young boy and weak, and he couldn't take the physical stuff. I'm not sure what his issue was. But it was through that, so they just like, this kid's useless, So he spent a lot of his time in the house, God's providence, because he learned to read, and he saw a Bible, and he began to read and study the Bible as a 9 and 10-year-old. And he saturated himself with it. And by the time he was 12, he came under the conviction that the Church of England, to which his uncles belonged, and was the only legal church to belong to. By the time he was 12 years old, he came under the conviction that this illegal separatist movement of Puritans are the people of a godly sort, and I want connection with them. And he had heard one or two separatist Puritan preachers preaching illegally at homes or undercover. And here he is, like he's 11, 12 years old, listening. He says, that matches what I'm reading in the Bible. And he told his uncles, I'm not going to the Church of England anymore with you on Sundays. It's illegal, And they were not pleased with what he was doing. But as a 12-year-old, he began to have to meet on the sly with this little cliquey group that was just too much to the far right in the Puritan world of the Church of England. And so he joined himself amongst them. I have with me, I'm not going to read almost anything, hardly, from Bradford. I'm going to read to you from the Providence Journal. I never thought I'd do that for Thanksgiving. It's like reading from the Pravda Journal. But this is the Providence Journal. Now, it's a little old. But this is by Hugh Mulligan. It's entitled Pilgrims Bradford Was Man of Courage. This is from the Providence Journal, November 28th, 1963. And I want to read some excerpts. It gives us an idea of what it was like to be William Bradford, as told in the Providence Journal. Bradford's religious beliefs in opposition to the Romanish practices of the Church of England soon led him to the little village of Scrooby, where he came under the sway of Postmaster William Brewster, an elder in the separatist movement, who was to be his lifelong friend and confidant in the New World. We don't have many lifelong Christian friends anymore because they don't think like that. They don't have the same convictions. Like the rest of the world, they're here today, gone tomorrow. That wasn't the way it was with William Brewster and William Bradford. And he was only like 11 or 12. King James's promise to, quote, harry all dissenters, end quote, out of the land, get rid of all the separatists, was not long in catching up with the little colony at Scrooby. When Brewster and four others were summoned before the Ecclesiastical Commission in York, the congregation resolved to flee to Holland. They had enough persecution in England. It's time to go. A British sea captain hired to take them to Amsterdam betrayed them to the king's troops. Scarcely 18 years old, Bradford was imprisoned in Lincolnshire for a month. Think of your average 18-year-old Christian today. Bradford's 18 years old because he had a conviction when he was 12. And he's in prison for a month because of his faith in Christ. Next, a Dutch captain tried to get them across. The men went aboard first, but troops arrived before the women, and children could be taken on at another point. In panic, the captain weighed anchor and headed out to sea. After a harrowing storm that drove the ship close to the coast of Norway, and realized it had gone that far off, the men finally reached Holland but it was nearly a year before their families got over. See, it's just hardship after another. A farmer by upbringing, William Bradford settled down with the Scrooby congregation in Leiden to learn the silk weaver's trade and later to become a worker in twill cloth. He became fluent in French and Dutch and took out citizenship, bought a house, and married 16-year-old Dorothy May, who in time bore him a son. The Scrooby folk flourished in exile, but with war threatening between Spain and Holland, they determined to seek refuge in the new land that fired their imaginations in the maps and writings of Captain John Smith. Obstacles beset them on all sides. Nothing new. King James had to be coaxed into letting them go. Elder Brewster had to be smuggled aboard the Mayflower with a price on his head for printing seditious tracts that were true, by the way. They started out in 2 ships, but the Speedwell, which was to have been their fishing boat in the New World, was overmasted, leaked badly, and had to be abandoned. They hoped to be underway by early summer, but it was September 6 before the high-pooped, deep-bellied, 3-masted, 180-ton Mayflower set sail for Plymouth with 102 passengers. Some had been aboard for 7 weeks. Moving at only 2 knots, it would be more than 2 months before the Mayflower dropped anchor again. And you know about some of the stuff in the journey there. And then we read, I'm not reading this in order because I'm trying to just kind of do it more chronologically. He isn't doing this chronologically. I'm trying to do that a little bit more. He says only 31 at the time. Bradford was only 31 years old when he was elected to be governor, once they're over there. A silk weaver by trade and a pilgrim. I like this. A silk weaver by trade and a pilgrim by rigid choice of conscience. Yes. Bradford was to govern Plymouth for 30 of the next 35 years and to put indelibly the stamp of his remarkable character on the New World, on the New World's first successful experiment in democracy, as they describe it. It was he who molded Plymouth into what it was to become, a shining symbol of harmonious self-government, of a hard-working, God-fearing, free society ruled by love and laws, at peace with its neighbors, but ever ready to defend itself in case of attack. A symbol that was to have an effect far beyond the boundaries and far beyond the lifespan of the tiny colony. A little bit later, this is all designed to show you the importance of Bradford, but how hard it was from the beginning for him. He took over the fortunes of the colony at a desperate time. John Carver, the first governor, fell dead of sunstroke on a balmy April day shortly after the Mayflower sailed home to England. And that was after they were all dying that first winter. His death climaxed a series of grim tragedies that decimated the colony in the first few months in the New World. Of the 102 Mayflower passengers who survived the hazardous 65-day ocean voyage to step ashore on that bleak and forbidding coast, only 56 lived through the first winter. Scarcely 20 men were on hand in the Common House to pick the new governor. The young man they chose already knew much of suffering and sorrow. That would be Bradford. In the cold, dark waters off Provincetown, his 23-year-old wife, Dorothy, lay buried. On a bitter December day, while her husband was off in the longboat on the final expedition that resulted in the discovery of the fine harbor at Plymouth, she had either jumped or fallen from the high deck of the Mayflower. Bradford's sleep was tormented by memories of her pining away for the 5-year-old son they had left behind in Holland. You know, when you think you have it hard, think of Jonathan. Think of William Bradford. Somehow, through sickness and death, through threat of starvation and Indian attack, through the howling storms of winter and the drenching rains of spring, Plymouth endured. The little graveyard on the hill, where bodies were taken by dark of night, lest the Indians learn of their weakness, received no new tenants for a while, and the tiny settlement gradually regained its strength. By fall, the governor could proclaim a day of Thanksgiving. Think of all that's happened, and he says, it's time for Thanksgiving. And I had this one guy working for me. The Pilgrims weren't Christians, they drank beer. Stop talking. Close that mouth. He declared a feast of Thanksgiving, a feast that lasted 3 days and saw Miles Standish drill his little company up and down Plymouth's Main Street for the edification of the 90 braves who showed up. You killed 2 birds with 1 stone. It's rejoicing, and hey, just be aware, we've got the means, You do what you got to do. And then I skip in things, I go over here. Now listen to this. This is from the first landfall, the sighting of the clay bluffs at Truro. One of my favorite motels there in Truro. I think it is. It just is. Bradford rapidly grew in stature in the eyes of his fellow colonists. He took part in all the hazardous explorations up and down the coast, sloshing through snow and on those long night marches, falling into an Indian deer trap, chasing after savages who watched them from the woods but seldom ventured closer, finding their cache of corn in an old iron kettle, and finally exchanging musket fire for a shower of arrows in that famous first encounter, which fortunately drew no blood, but left each side with a healthy respect for the other. These adventures, these trials and tribulations from 1 year old and 3 years old and 8 years old and 12 years old and 18 years old, right up until here, these adventures steeled Bradford for even tougher trials in the years ahead. After they're there. After the first grim winter, the first Thanksgiving Day proved only a brief respite from the dangers and misfortunes that constantly beset the colony. The harvest had hardly been gathered in when the Fortune sailed into Plymouth Harbor with 35 more hungry mouths to feed. Worse still, loaded with otter, beaver, clapboard, and other fruits of the Pilgrims' labor to pay off their debts, to ship back to England. She was hijacked by French pirates on the way back to England. Her cargo of furs alone would have paid off half the colony's debt. Well, they went to work that first year. But her loss and similar tragedies left the Pilgrims wallowing in financial difficulties for another 25 years. Bradford ruled Plymouth with an almost instinctive blend of tolerance and firmness as the years fled down the calendar, each with its measure of triumph and tragedy. In the midst of a 2-month drought, Bradford decreed a day of prayer and fasting and saw it rain that very night. 2 months, no rain. They said, let's get together and pray for rain. It came the same night. For years, he struggled to free the colony of debt. Bradford did. Now listen to what he did. Now think of everything he's going through constantly. He codified its laws of Plymouth. He codified their laws, married its lovers, presided in its court, directed its trade, prophesied in its church on Sunday, negotiated its treaties with the Indians, and the new colonies springing up all around. Once a month, the town meeting convened in his house at the southwest corner of Plymouth's colony, Plymouth's only 2 streets. The house was already occupied by Alice Southworth, the widow whom he married in 1623, after his other wife had died. Her 2 children, the 3 she bore him, his first son, John, who eventually came over, and 4 orphan boys. You know, you get the idea. He was a fairly busy man with all sorts of trials. And yet he takes on 4 orphan boys. You get a little picture? Imagine you go down to Plymouth now, and they have these radicals saying that this is all genocide, this is murder, we need to get rid of Thanksgiving Day. Somehow, now here's the last thing I'll read here. Somehow, in the midst of everything, when everything goes wrong nonstop, the governor found time to begin jotting down in a vellum-bound journal his history of Plymouth Plantation, now regarded as an American masterpiece. That's the journal in 1963. And of course, well, and right to the end of their life, where I won't read the whole thing, I don't have time, but Bradford talked about the second generation of the young people that they raised, and they were leaving to go to bigger towns, bigger churches, and have new ways of life. And Bradford said, "O sacred bond, whilst inviolably preserved, how sweet and precious were the fruits that flowed from the same. But when this fidelity decayed, then their ruin approached. Oh, that these ancient members had not died or been dissipated, or else that this holy care and constant faithfulness had still lived and remained with those that survived their children, and were in times afterward added unto them and amongst the newcomers. But alas, that subtle serpent hath slyly wound in himself under fair pretenses of necessity and the like, to untwist these sacred bonds." Oh, there's always reasons. "And as it were insensibly by degrees to dissolve, or in great measure to weaken the bond of the assembly with the young people. I have been happy in my first times to see, and with much comfort to enjoy the blessed fruits of this sweet communion, in spite of all those problems. But it is now a part of my misery and old age to find and feel the decay and want thereof, of that bond, and with grief and sorrow of heart, to lament and bewail the same. And for others' warning," that's why I read it, he said, "for others' warning." It didn't seem to stick with some of our young people. Say, don't be so frank. What's the point then? "And for others' warning and admonition." And then he says, "and for my own humiliation. Do I here note the same?" And then the author, I don't mean Bradford, but the editor, he makes this observation, which I think is a nice one. And by the way, you know what Bradford just said? We've never had a dwelling place like Moses. The author says here, the editor, "Bradford's note is deeply moving, and there is no debating the depth of his despair. The passing of the first generation of settlers and the indifference of the younger generation to issues of conscience. Remember, at 12, he joined themselves out of the conviction of the rigors of his conscience, for which the Leiden community had risked everything. It was hard for Bradford to bear. Now, and that summary is only a summary. There's so many details of hardships they went through after they got here, and even the ones on the sea and the ones between England and Holland, that it was an overview. It was enough to say, okay, they didn't have it easy. How did they live? I mean, in the midst of all those trials and tribulations and persecutions and sickness and death and betrayals and abandonments and hardships of every sort, seemingly at all times, what are they supposed to do? Everything seems to go wrong. There's different ways to say the same thing, but I'll just read one brief statement by Bradford that I've read many times, and I read it many times for good reason. I won't even read the whole context, which is worthy of it, but so Bradford writes, so they left their that goodly and pleasant city, which had been their resting place near 12 years over in Holland. But they knew they were pilgrims. This is why we read Hebrews 11. But they knew they were pilgrims and looked not much on those things. What's those things he's talking about? The trouble, the trials, the burdens, the crosses, the losses. They knew they were pilgrims and looked not much on those things, but lift up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. In other words, they were pilgrims. And him saying that in that text is what gave them that name. They didn't go around saying we're pilgrims like some kind of title. This is history that's done that. They realized the magnitude of that statement in that history. This world was not their home. Like Moses, they had no dwelling place in this world. When Bradford didn't, his dad left him at 1, about 3 or 4. Went to his grandfather's, but he died almost immediately. Abandoned by his mother to the grandfather. Then goes back to his mother. Mother dies, and stepfather doesn't want him. Gives him off to 2 uncles. Didn't really care too much about him, and didn't like what he was doing. At 12 years old, he found a home with the Clayville Assembly. But the Clayville Assembly, where was their home? Scrooby, take off to Holland, then escape to the New World, and one trial and burden after another. They were pilgrims. This world was not their home. They had no dwelling place in this world. But like Moses said, the Lord is our dwelling place. We don't need one here. The world was not their home. There, the pilgrim's purpose and their hope came from the promises of God in Christ as they learned them by the Spirit through the Scriptures. They knew they were pilgrims and looked not much on those things. The sufferings prepared them for the next ones and the next ones. We say, why would they have to go through that? Well, think of how this can minister to any Christian that's thinking for a moment. They faced what was before them that moment. And by faith, they put their trust in the Lord God and determined to do God's will in the moment that was in front of them, just like Jonathan. And something else to remember, they accepted their lot as being God's providential will. That's big. Well, no, this is an aberration. The Lord just allowing this. It isn't really his will. No, the Lord has called them to minister as his servants in that. That's you can't not see that and read Bradford's history. Everything is all in the context of God's providence, the crosses and everything. Not like, oh, something's going along, deliver us from the hand of Satan. And sometimes would say deliver us from the hand of Satan, but the overall overarching truth that they would acknowledge, and Bradford would write time, this is your will for us now. This is your providence. And they'd ask for him to intervene or to show grace. So now we got to take all that and make it valuable to us. Well, when we look at what we're facing in this country, as exists here in 2023, in my opinion, everything's upside down. Everything is unstable, evil. It goes so far back, and it looks like that's the trajectory for the future. So what are we supposed to do? We can't control the situation, just like Jonathan. How then shall we live? That's the question Francis Schaeffer asked when he looked at the history of the world up till 1976 and said, let me tell you where this is going. And we're living it out. So what are we supposed to do? What about the Christians that are being killed in the Gaza Strip? What are they supposed to do? The Christian community in America has pretty much forgotten any of those. Because we got to save Israel, fake Israel. Just make the place like a parking lot. What about the Lord's people that are there? Well, collateral damage, I guess. When you're in a war-torn area and you feel like your own people have forgotten you, well, then things feel hopeless. They're human beings like everyone else. Like David, when he was talking to Jonathan, it says, it's only just one step between me and death. David was beside himself. He's one of the greatest examples of faith you can look at in the Bible. So how should we then live in what we've inherited in 2023? Well, I would just say this. It's simple. Remember that this world is not our home, and that the Lord is our dwelling place, just as he was for Moses. And you also ought to remember that we are pilgrims on this earth. All you got to do is go to a family gathering where there's a bunch of unconverted people. You realize, okay, there's a lot of out-of-syncness going on. You can go to Christian gatherings, there's a lot of out-of-syncness going on. We're pilgrims on this earth. And we should look for a better country, that is, a heavenly. We are in the New Jerusalem now, but right now, by faith, we are actually in it, in the kingdom. But we're only experiencing it on this earth through the lens of faith. It's not until we go from this life to the next that we know it by our senses, if I can use that phrase. So until we arrive to our final destination, we too have to live. Until we end up in that final destination, we have to, like Jonathan, like Moses, and like our pilgrim forefathers, we too have to face what is before us in the moment that we're in, and then by faith, determine to do what is right according to God's will. And then just do that the next time and the next time, and you will have lived your life in the will of God and received the blessings of being in that place. And understand this as well, each of us, that this age we are in 2023 in America, at Clayville Assembly, is the age and the place God has called each and every one of us to be in. People move geographically to escape reality. People go from church A to church B to escape reality. People remove themselves from their spouses to marry other ones to escape reality. We're not called to escape reality. We're called to witness in the middle of it. We're supposed to be the loyal, faithful, God-fearing, honorable ones, like we just read about in the Providence Journal. And like we read about in Samuel with Jonathan. It's really not that hard then. Just, you can't control the situation, neither can I. So let's just do what's right, whatever's in front of us. The Lord will take care of the rest. Bow our heads in prayer. Heavenly Father, the truth is simple. Our obligation is obvious. What's difficult sometimes, Lord, is we can't always understand the overarching reality of what you're doing in your providence. But that's not for us to concern ourselves with. By faith, Lord, or through faith, just teach us to do thy will in this place that you have called us to, at this time you have called us to, in the sphere of influence that thou hast given to us. And in so doing, may we find purpose, meaning, and hope, love, joy, and peace in the midst of a sin-cursed earth. And in so doing, may we be lights in the midst of a very dark world. We pray this in Jesus' name.